Let's start.
So my name is Jen Glesson. I'm a staff attorney for the U.S. Office of the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, ELAW, and I'm here at a conference with EPL in Ukraine, here to talk about climate litigation cases. For years, we have been looking at asking governments to require corporations to stop emitting greenhouse gases so they can stop climate damages. And we've been wanting to hold the corporations who are responsible for this financially liable. The scientists are ready to help us model the impacts that we're seeing, and so they can look at a particular heat wave and figure out whether that heat wave was more likely than not caused because of anthropogenic climate change. We have been missing one other piece of information, which we now have in our hands, which is how much each corporation is responsible for contributing to cumulative global emissions of greenhouse gases. The Climate Accountability Institute did this research for us. It took many years for them, but they can now say that, for example, Chevron's responsible for the most emissions. They're responsible for 3.52% of cumulative global emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, we need to remember that percentage. It was 3.52%, and we're going to come back to that. But this data about these corporations is available on a website called carbonmajors.org. This is 90 entities that are responsible for 63%, so the great majority of cumulative global emissions from 1751 to 2010. It includes 50 investor-owned entities, 31 state-owned entities, and 9 government-run industries. It includes fossil fuel producers as well as 7 cement manufacturers. With this information in hand, lawyers are able to say that, for example, Chevron should pay their share, which would be 3.52%, of a community's damages, of what it's going to cost them to adapt to climate change, or whatever it is those damages might be. So I want to look today at a string of cases. This is, 10, 15 cases that I want to talk about. There's many more cases. These cases are winding their way through the courts. There's been some early cases in the US that were not ultimately successful, but they're helping tell the public the story about what's happening with climate change. So even the cases that ultimately lost in court have been successful and really important for helping us move forward with climate justice. I want to start with one case in the United States, Massachusetts versus EPA, which is really important because it was a US Supreme Court case. And it was a case in which the US Supreme Court said the harms associated with climate change are serious and well recognized. For the US Supreme Court to acknowledge that climate damage is happening and that it's well accepted and well recognized was really important. It's a watershed moment. This case was about whether or not the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, had the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions in transportation from automobiles. The Supreme Court said, yes, the EPA does have that authority under the Clean Air Act, and it should go back and consider whether or not it should regulate carbon emissions. That decision that EPA needed to make triggered a series of regulatory decisions, which ends up today with EPA regulating carbon that's coming from coal-fired power plants, which is very important, of course, for regulating greenhouse gas emissions. But what I want to look at is how this decision helped move us forward in other cases. Another case that's not this one, a case called AEP, was another case winding its way through the courts when the Supreme Court decided Massachusetts versus EPA. That was a nuisance case that was brought against 5 energy companies in the United States, where some states, some local municipalities, and some organizations were asking the court to require those energy entities to abate their emissions. But in that case, the Supreme Court said, we've already decided that this needs to be regulated under the Clean Air Act. And so that case was unsuccessful, but again, it was one of the cases that really helped move forward this story of climate change and help people understand what's really happening. A second case that was winding its way through the court when Massachusetts was decided was this one, the native village of Kivalina versus ExxonMobil. As you can see by this picture, this native village in Alaska is literally losing its land. It's falling into the sea. This community needs to be relocated, and it's going to cost them a lot of money to relocate. So they were asking the companies who are responsible for the global greenhouse gas emissions to pay for them to move inland. Unfortunately, in this one, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decided that Massachusetts tells us that emissions are regulated under the Clean Air Act, and so this case also could not move forward. I disagree with that decision because this is a case looking for damages, not for emission abatement, but that's what the court decided, and so that was the end of this case. I want to make it clear that this isn't the end of tort cases in the United States. Someone could still file a case in state court asking for damages associated with climate change. For example, this case could have been refiled in state court. There's no reason that that couldn't happen. And so the doors are still open in the United States for a court to hold a fossil fuel company financially liable for climate change. Now, another string of cases I want to look at that's really exciting, this case from the Netherlands is a decision that came down last year in 2015. It's very exciting. A group called Urgent Agenda went to court to ask the court to tell Netherlands to do more than it was already doing to mitigate climate damages. Netherlands was already on target to reduce its emissions by 17% by 2020. But this organization said that's not enough. We need to do more. We need to reduce our emissions by 25 to 40%. So the court looked at international law, it looked at state law, it looked at all these obligations, and said that the state had a serious duty of care to these organizations and to the citizens of the Netherlands to do more to mitigate climate damages. And so the court ordered the Dutch government to reduce its emissions by 25%. And in doing so, it used a lot of beautiful language that can be used in other cases. And note that even though Netherlands emissions, global emissions, are 0.5% of global emissions, so 0.5%, the court said that there is a sufficient causal link can be assumed to exist between Dutch emissions and global climate change and the effects. 0.5%. Now this is where I want to go back and remember that Chevron was responsible for 3.52% of global emissions. So if the Netherlands, if the court says that 0.5% is contributing to what we're seeing, these effects from global climate change, then clearly the emissions of Chevron or any one of these other entities is contributing to global climate change and the effects. Building on this case in the Netherlands, there are two cases right now. One's been filed in Belgium, and another one has been filed in New Zealand, both modeled after the Urgenda case. And I should say that the Urgenda case is currently on appeal. The government is appealing that case. Back in the United States, there's another string of cases that are trying to hold governments responsible and asking governments to take more action to reduce climate change. There's a great theory called the atmospheric trust litigation that argues that our atmosphere is part of the public trust and the government must protect it for the citizens of the United States. An organization called Our Children's Trust has supported cases in administrative courts or in state court in all 50 states on behalf of the youth who are seeing the impacts and who are bringing these cases. They have an incredible voice. These cases are winding their way through the courts right now. But one really important part of this campaign is the videos that have been produced. There's an organization called Witness.org, that has produced a video about each one of these youth stories. And they're beautiful videos that really help people start to understand how climate change is impacting us now. And so the atmospheric trust litigation is a great package of telling the story of advocacy as well as court and administrative cases. I want to look a little bit at one of these cases. One is the federal court case that a magistrate just issued a recommendation last month that we hope will be adopted by the district court. But in that decision, the magistrate looked back to Massachusetts versus EPA, and it also looked back to the agenda case from Netherlands to decide that these youth do have a case that should move forward, and the court does have the authority to do something about it. And for me, it's really exciting to see a U.S. court citing to a case from the Netherlands. And so each of these cases are building on each other, and they're starting to tell a story. One of the last ones I want to look at is a case from Pakistan. And in this one, it's similar to the agenda case in Netherlands, but instead of saying, government, you need to reduce emissions, it was saying, government, you're not doing enough to help the citizens of Pakistan who need to adapt to climate change. Our water, our food, our energy sources are all threatened by climate change, and you're not doing enough. So they went to court, and the court said, from environmental justice, we need to move to climate change justice. And it issued a beautiful opinion with lots of great language and required the creation of a climate change commission, which would bring together the various ministries, the various agencies responsible for addressing adaptation and mitigation. And the court kept continuing mandamus over that. The court is requiring the commission to come back and report to it about how it is progressing on adaptation to protect the citizens of Pakistan. Again, it's another case with beautiful language in it that we can all use. Finally, I want to quickly look at two cases that we should all be keeping our eyes on. These have been submitted to courts, but no action's been taken yet. Another case in Pakistan is Rabab Ali versus the Federation of Pakistan and the province of Sindh. In this case, it builds on the public trust doctrine cases, it builds on the agenda case. It's asking the court to both deal with adaptation and mitigation, but it has novel legal theory, which is based on the intended nationally determined contributions, the INDCs. Each country went forward to the last meeting of the Climate Convention in Paris and said, this is what we will contribute to reducing global emissions and to adaptation. And so this case argues that Pakistan didn't commit to doing enough, and at the same time, Pakistan isn't meeting its obligations, and so it needs to do more to meet its INDC. Finally, a case in Germany was filed on behalf of a Peruvian farmer whose property is threatened by glacial lake outburst flooding. The lake above his home has increased like 8 times in the last 40 years, and his property is threatened by a flood coming from that lake. And so he is suing RWE, a German energy company. This company is one of the carbon majors, and so we know the percentage of emissions that RWE is responsible for. And Sol Luciano is asking RWE to contribute that much to what he needs to pay to protect himself from a potential flooding. Currently, RWE has answered that they're not responsible, and we'll see what happens as this progresses through the courts. Sorry, there is one more. There's Philippines. In the Philippines, Greenpeace Southeast Asia in the Philippines filed a human rights petition against the fossil fuel companies that are investor-owned of the carbon majors. And so they're leaving out the cement plants, looking at the investor-owned entities, and saying that the fossil fuels that they have produced have led to emissions that have impacted people in the human rights of people in the Philippines, including those who have been impacted by severe storms, severe typhoon, and asking the commission to open an investigation. The commission has opened an investigation, And last week, the commission should be serving summons on each of the named entities. And this is going to be another one that we should all keep an eye on as it progresses through the commission. So I think that I left out a few of them, but these really are all winding together and telling a story, and I'm very excited about what could happen next. One last piece is that my organization, ELA, is doing research with partners in several countries about the laws that exist to bring these cases. And so that research is available on our website, ela.org. And with that, I am happy to continue this discussion with everyone. Thank you.